We'll now hand over to our panel of experts. So we've got some initial questions that came in from the audience as part of the registration process. I think Bill Keir actually just left us, but he did raise a question. A nice easy one to start with. Any tips for target contracts on pain and gain share mechanisms? So we've got a single microphone so you don't sort of rush to talk over each other.
Sounds like a broom. He's written a book on it. So.
Well, an academic paper years ago where I'm trying to remember, it was Broom and Perry's something or other model or something like that. The first thing is I divided it up into, I'll do the simplified model, 4 zones. There's 2 zones around the target, which is sort of what's the likely good, bad outcome, yeah? And those go up to a certain point where it's what's a bad result, yeah? And what's a really good result. And the bad result, the zone between, say, it could be plus 20% overrun, is this point at which the contractor starts to go, I can't bear this potentially, yep. So if you're a big client, small contractor, you might say, so water company, one of my regular clients is a water company, they say beyond a certain point, the project's gone so badly, neither of us anticipated it, yep. And we're the bigger organisation, we have money coming in, year out. If it goes wrong, who's best able to bear that significant loss, yeah? So they, in that instance, switch to they're taking the majority of the pain. Not all of the pain, because they still want the contractor to have some skin in the game, but not all of it. On the other hand, you could switch that around and say, well, actually, I'm a small client and I'm contracting with a big contractor who's best able to take the pain, and it might be different. So there's one of the things is consideration of the actual project and the risk profile of it. The other thing is the actual individual businesses and their ability, and it's the effect on their business. So the worst case scenario is insolvency, yeah. Turning that round on the positive side is, well, actually, if we're taking the majority of the pain for any bad result, actually, if we have a really good result, we want to take the majority of the gain. But again, do we take all the gain? Well, then the motivation to actually contribute disappears, yeah. So I suppose the risk bit is the riskiness of the project is what's the boundaries, the plus minus for a good stroke bad result, but not really bad. And then beyond that, you need to really look at the, particularly on the downside, the ability to bear that downside. Does that help? Oh, it's gone, hasn't he?
That's brilliant. Was there anyone else on the panel like to add?
Yeah, the only thing, certainly when we're looking at target costs, is to actually really analyse that to make sure it's a proper target. I think we spend a lot of time with quantity surveying firms actually really drilling down on that, because there can be a fair amount of gamemanship, I think, on the target. So that's what I'll add.
Yeah, and I suppose related to that is what the risk profile is. What risks are compensation events? Are you adjusting the compensation events as well?
Yeah, but I just add, caps on pain and gain. Well, caps on pain, I'm fairly comfortable with as long as it's a distance from the target. So in excess of say 110%. Caps on gain, I've never liked. It should be infinite, because the only reason you'd want to cap gain is because you think you've got your number wrong at the start. And it'd be embarrassing to report it internally that, well, we're suddenly giving them 50% of a saving, or 50% of it as a saving. So, for me, if that's the mechanism somebody wants to design, what it tells me is you really should do your homework more on the number at the start to make sure it's the right number.
Yeah, I would reiterate that. I think Brian and Neil have made a couple of good points there. I think. When I look, what I say when I do training on target contracts is that you've got to get the target right. I mean, I worked on Heathrow Express. We had a tunnel collapse. The first number the contractor came in was 202 million. After 3 months of interrogating and really understand, and this is the point I think you've got to get to, to understand what is that scope, what is in that scope, where are the risks lie. in terms of what are you signing up to? Do we understand and manage those risks in those areas? It's one of my pet questions in training. How long? Oh, you're on a £20 million target cost. Oh, well, how long did it take you to do the target? Oh, yeah, we did it in a couple of days. Really? You know, and I think, to me, if you don't get that target right, you can have all the clever numbers at the other end, it ain't going to work, is it? And like you were saying about, you know, the soft targets with, you know, Highways Agency, where they're always, you know, a contractor, naturally, if you're going to make sure that you've got a fairly fat price in there, because then you're always going to beat the target. So it's interesting, and the same thing on CTRL, where they have the same thing, where if they realise you go 20% above the target price, you know, they took some pain, the contractors, and shared the pain with the client. But once you get over 20%, you know, they switch to that point, well, we've got to get this job finished on a big project. Actually, the client in that instance decided to pay everything apart from the fee. So it's a really interesting, but to me, the key is getting that target and understanding what that scope and target is really telling you, and then managing those assumptions, those risks, and those areas. That's the key to me, and then it might work at the other end with the percentages. Yeah.
I'd just add in, I looked at incentive mechanisms in general, of which target cost contracts are one. All the literature says for an effective incentive mechanism, the starting point's got to be realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
John, a question for you. Actually, the papers that you talked about, are they available to download off your website?
No, it was published years and years and years ago.
Okay.
But if you buy NEC4, a user's guide, the top-selling book from the ICE last year, Barry, then that model's in there. That explanation's in there.
Excellent, thank you. Any other resources that you guys are aware of on the web that would be useful? I know we've got a free NEC share calculator, but like you say, that does the maths for you at the end, which some people do get a little bit confused. Yeah, it doesn't do the thinking, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that's available for free on the website. But again, I don't know if you guys have got any blog articles or related sort of material. No, okay, fine. Any other questions relating to share calculations, just from the feedback we've had on that answer? No? Okay, I will move on. We've got a question here from Polly Chandler. How do we drive the benefits of two-stage design and build approach? Microphone's still in John's hand.
Anybody else? Yes, I'll think about that.
Well, I think, you know, the key, isn't it? I think in that first stage, and it's the same with ECI. I think Don touched on that earlier when he was doing his presentation. You've really got to nail down, haven't you, what you want to do. And at the end of that stage, in terms of the price, the programme, and the scope, and that I think is absolutely key then to going into that second stage, isn't it? Because you've invested, and if that means you need to get the design sorted out, to, you know, maybe we set off too early on some of the design. I remember on CTRL we went off on 60% design, and we forgot to do the last 40%, so that was interesting. So lots of compensation and things. But I think it's got to start with that. It's got to start with the getting that design right. And I think I could be wrong on this, but I thought in ERA, for instance, I think on public procurement, don't you have to get the first stage where you've got to get the designs on before you can actually go into the construction phase? And I think getting that, if you set off part and part, I've had some bad experiences where, you know, that design hasn't been completed and you go into stage 2 and you're still designing, and that can actually be a recipe for disaster a little bit.
I think in my experience, we've certainly when we're using ECI under NEC, you've got to have a really good timetable to run the ECI process. So you've got to have a set of deliverables. You've probably got to have some sort of sanction if those deliverables aren't actually achieved. Because otherwise, you know, with the best will in the world, sometimes the contractor will leave things very, very late, and then you're in a bit of a pickle because the design doesn't really reflect what it should do. The cost doesn't reflect. So, in my experience, we've amended the works information, the contract slightly to really drive those timetables to get the best out of ECI. So that's what I'd add.
Yeah, putting a sort of project management head on, go way back before you even start drafting the scope or works information. A good business case, what's in, what's out of the project, a good package breakdown structure so you know who's doing what in what package, and then make sure, first of all, that what I call the breadth of the package reflects what you want them to do. There's not bits outside of it which you're going to add in. because it's not just the direct costs of adding it in. If it's got a program implication, you've got time-related costs as well in there. And then it's what's sufficient detail so that you know you're going to get what you want, but you allow the contractor innovation. And then when I think back to the lessons we learned with Connect Plus, with our ECIs, and going with contractors, it's not just going, ooh, ECI, that's collaborative, isn't it? Get in a room and we'll be fine, yeah? You actually scope out what's expected in terms of that at the end of that ECI phase. Relates to the other points that you've made. You know, what are the deliverables you need to have in place before we're to proceed to stage 2? And then the contractor can program that out and so on. Okay, so good project management, basically. And I think that relates to all the points William made, to be honest, about avoiding adjudication.
Yeah, I think so. The last ECI project I was involved in probably suffered from the client taking it too far without getting the contractor involved. To give you a bit of empirical understanding of that, they had developed this design that simply didn't work, and they come up with 2 alternatives that simply didn't work. And as soon as they got in bed with the contractor, they glaringly obviously pointed that out. So it links back to the point you made earlier, John. Early contractor involvement is probably the best step in all of that. You can't really have it early enough. It's sort of a minor point.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any other questions related to D&B approach before we move on? No? Okay, excellent. Got a question here from Laura, so it's quite long. If a compensation rate is raised by a project manager under clause 60.11, does this price, if it's over 10% of the contract value, have to be uplifted in your performance bond, even if the works is not additional scope but a delay claim? So I think a short version of that is, I guess, is...
Do you want to jump in, Brad? I think the short answer is no.
The answer is no. I mean, the standard drafting is for a performance bond at a fixed sum at the start of the contract, so it doesn't actually track. But you could actually draft something to make it track at certain points during the project.
Revise it.
As the contract sum goes up to revise it. So I have seen something similar before. So.
Okay, excellent. Well, Laura, if you're in the audience, come and see Brian afterwards if you need some help drafting.
Maybe jump into sort of tangential point. Clients in the room that are asking for bespoke bonds, I don't quite understand the logic for doing that. There is ABI model bonds out there in the industry that sureties and bondsmen are used to providing, and from a contractor's perspective, they know how much they cost. So if you're then introducing at tender stage these bonds that have, slightly changed wording, that has big problems because it's going to have to involve the contractor going back to the bondsman to renegotiate the thing. That just adds extra time and effort. Standard documents, leave them standard.
Good shout. Thank you, William. Next question from Simon is, what do we believe is an ideal commercial model when alliancing to drive the best behaviours in both the pain and gain share scenarios? Do you want to read that again? What do we believe what do we believe to be the ideal commercial model when alliancing to drive the best behaviours when both in pain and in gain scenarios?
I think that's very similar to the first question. It all boils down to, as John says, making a realistic target at the outset. So that needs to be part of the model or the strategy, in effect. Aside from that, in my opinion, 50-50.
Yeah.
Don't overcomplicate it.
Maybe I
might be
stupid.
Yeah, so alliancing, you could say I like type 4 model, I think it is, where you've got a budget, but instead of it being shared, the pain gain being shared between a contractor and the client, there might be numerous contractors and a consultant involved there. Years ago, when I wrote that very grey and dull book in terms of the cover, and elsewhere, I looked at how alliance targets had been agreed, and I came up with a whole load of criteria: financial strength, contribution, etc., and so on. But ultimately, you might have those in the back of your mind, but then people get in the room and the senior people negotiate it. And you can have all the rational stuff there, but also there's the culture of risk, your attitude to risk. You know, some people will be very willing to take on risk because that's their organisational culture, you know, but they'll expect a better upside. Others will know, whoa, yeah, despite being a financially strong organisation. So lots of criteria you can logically put up, but it does come down to the people factor.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think John's touched on that. And again, when you go to alliancing, and obviously you've got a mix of different organisations, and I think, again, a bit like the target cost side of thing, you know, everybody needs to understand what they're doing as part of those packages. And I think the other point that John touched on as well is that certainly I've been, you know, on a big alliance project where they had a very interesting, because at the highest level they had an alliance, but then the contracts that we're letting were just traditional NEC contracts, and that was quite interesting. There was a bit of, you know, I think people were confused about the way they should act in terms of this is how we manage an NEC contract at one level, but then we've got how we're going to act in terms of being at the alliance level. So I think, yeah, those are key things, aren't they, to understand,
Yeah.
and the understanding that you're all in it together effectively.
Yeah, and it's coherence down the
Yeah.
supply chain, not just, oh, we've got a fancy model up here, but it's the same down there. Because
Yeah.
there's then disjoint.
It was definitely a disconnect, and I think that's definitely a point, isn't it? How are you going to drive that down the whole supply chain if you're going to go that way? And it can be really inefficient in terms of that. And I think for the people, it was just confusing because one day, you know, they might be dealing with a package contract, and then the next day they're in the alliance. But that cultural shift, that shift in mentality, was really quite interesting. I think you've got to invest in making sure people understand what's expected of them. It doesn't happen naturally.
We've currently got a client using the NEC alliancing contract on an oil refinery based down in Southampton, and I know there's been quite a steep learning curve for the team. And in my experience, having done quite a lot in the nuclear sector, and there's actually similarities, I guess, in petrochem in terms of the complexity of the projects. Yeah. When we do see alliancing, I tend to find that the partners are sort of brought together in this marriage, normally because there isn't one single entity that can actually do it all. So this project for ExxonMobil, they're effectively manufacturing it off-site, and then there's a whole raft of more traditional construction work that's done around it. So I guess the risks in that alliancing contract are not shared. To my mind, wouldn't be shared evenly because the tasks that they're doing are fundamentally quite different. I know in some of the previous ones I've been involved in the nuclear sector as well, there's been quite a lot of debate about who carries the respective risks within that gain share, because quite often it is sort of jointly severally liable for everyone, and actually you can have a person that's actually doing a relatively simple part of the construction works compared with some other partners in
It
the
could be
team.
relatively simple but high value, whereas another bit could be low value in terms of cost,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
big risk in terms of will the project work
Yeah.
and what happens if it goes wrong.
Yeah, and I've often seen moderators on that pain share, so it's not shared. I guess not shared evenly. Again, I read the word behaviours into that question more than perhaps you guys did. But
And perhaps one of the classic things I see in partnering, collaborative working is, let's do the mutual trust and cooperation bit. Running the contract or good project management, collaboration. And if push comes to shove, I would do good project management rather than just nice behaviours.
yeah,
I think touching on the behaviours as well, Chris, I think the other thing is that sometimes you find that the way that an alliance is set up, the roles are some of those roles are very different in the way that you're operating as well. And that behaviours thing is something, it takes a little bit of getting your head around how that actually works. And you've definitely got to invest in that so people understand what that role is.
Yeah, there's, like you say, there's a lot of new roles in the NEC alliancing contract. It's significantly more complicated than your ECC contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add to that getting the cultural alignment of the alliance partners is absolutely key to success. I mean, many years ago, I helped Angling Water set up their alliance, and there was an awful lot of effort put into the procurement to make sure there was a cultural fit amongst the alliance partners, and then an awful lot of effort for the first 6-9 months of mobilising the alliance to make sure that the behaviours were right. as well as all the other sort of health factors like systems and processes and things getting in place, but also governance structures and people understanding what the roles are and all the rest of it. So
Perhaps a more useful way of thinking, rather than behaviours, think of culture. And by culture, I mean organisational structure, systems, etc., rewards, the whole lot. Because my experience of working with some psychiatrists, or it's not psychiatrists, psychologists, that's a personal thing, is that they only look at the behaviours rather than the whole organisational culture, which is affected by all those things.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Oh, thank you, everyone. Actually, William, can I circle back around for a question I had from your presentation? So, in my experience, it's great that we've had so many sort of pragmatic presentations where we're not obviously covering the technical aspects of contract management, but also you sharing practical suggestions. You touched on a behavioural piece around a client that was sort of leading that sort of collaborative working, and I think that's I think for many people that's a bit of a dark art, and I was curious to try and put a bit more flesh on the bone around that. Is there, can you tell us a bit more about that story where you had a client that was actually able to help embed that collaborative working for the audience? Because I think
it's a very difficult question to answer because it very much depends on the individuals. That particular project, as I said during the presentation, was led by the client individual. If it was any other person in his position, it might not have went that way. So it really was that personality. And how do you instill that in everyone? I don't honestly know how you would do that.
We're speaking next year.
What's that?
We're getting him
speaking next year. But the point of that slide was he was only the crux of the idea. He was the one that started it, but everybody started to spin around him. So finding that crux is difficult. Some people are naturally good at it, some aren't. But the point is, if you can try to do it, people will start to spin around you and it will ultimately lead the project in a better direction. Okay. And he did that by, having that collaboration workshop, and that's how he started from the outset. That project was probably the least amended NEC contract I've ever worked with. It was an NEC 3 option A.
They exist.
I think that, honestly, I think the only Z clause was an amendment to allow the lump sum activities to be paid on a percentage basis, 25, 50, 75. I'm pretty sure that was the only Z clause.
Well, someone special then.
So it was very, again, just driven by that individual client.
Yeah. Okay.
Also, they had a very good project team. I'm not sure if that happened by chance, if the stars just happened to align. But I reckon that they were able to select their partners from the various different frameworks that they had. So they had a good project manager who, again, was pulling in the same direction. They knew it was an NEC project. They knew the benefits of working together. They had a very good main contractor, Morgan Sindall. I'll name drop them again. They worked very, very well. And again, even this is all coming back to me now. The contractor, Morgan Sindall's manager, was exactly the same. They were all just aligned culturally, and it links back to what you were saying. Getting the culture of the project right from the outset is what made that project so successful. And as far as I know, it was a complete success story. No fallouts, no adjudications.
They're a current customer, so we might try and track that individual down. See if we can get him here to speak.
I can pass you on his name.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that, William. Next question is sort of not really a question; it's a statement, but it's maybe one for yourself, Mark. Interested in the views of ECNI and the procurement regulations.
So back over to Brian on that one.
Yeah, we've looked at this as regards to the procurement regulations and ECI. If you go out and do a procurement that involves an ECI stage into a main contract, that's fine, as long as the procurement actually envisaged doing that. Mm-hmm. Where it actually runs into problems, and where we're seeing quite a few problems in the UK, is when you involve frameworks and ECI, particularly where you've got a long period of work. So I do a lot of work for highways contracts, and the period of a framework is 4 years. So you've really only just started talking about a major highways project within 4 years, and you'll go through the early design stage. But then the contractor may come to you, because of course the framework's going to end, and say, can we now enter into the main contract? And they'll use the ECI. And sometimes that's way too early to do it. Yeah. But we've looked at this question. There are some rules of thumb about how long beyond the end of a framework you can actually have a call-off. So, and when you think of a major highways project, it's going to be 7 or 8 years for a big one. So you're going to be running almost between two frameworks when you do that. So, but there is an answer, but you do really need to drill down on the way that the framework was procured, certain questions. And I'm sort of talking about the national frameworks. You're probably aware of some of these with the major contractors, you know, the one contractor frameworks. We've looked at this question, so yeah, I think that's the only problem you get with ECI is when you get on frameworks. But if you've gone out and procured in a two-stage manner, there's no particular problem.
Presumably, though, if you take a design and then give it to another contractor, you're going to have an equal number of problems as well.
Well, the client owns the design.
Yep.
And you know, this is quite a big question because if you do finish with a contractor, quite often the design team won't then be allowed to go on and work for a different contractor, so they'll lock it down. I think the majority of the ones I've been involved in, luckily, it's national contractors, and you can switch frameworks to a certain extent. But the client will own the design because he's paid for it.
Yep.
So therefore, you know, in most cases, he can take that design, give it to another contractor. It's not quite that simple. There's a lot of things to think about, but
Okay,
that's
excellent. Thank you. Moving on, so we've got a couple more questions and then some drinks afterwards. Contractor entitlement, when the indices in X1 doesn't keep track with inflation, what can the contractor do?
Thinking of my experience with one client, over-egg the compensation events. Quotations is one of them. Appeal to the better nature of the client and say, look, exceptional circumstances. That's two which spring to mind.
Yeah, I mean, you're stuck with it, aren't you? And that's the issue we've got in industry at the minute, is that I don't think indices are keeping up with actual cost pressures in industry.
Yeah.
And clients should be doing as much as they can to provide relief to their supply chain because it's an issue they can't control or manage.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're just stuck with what you've got. I mean, I had a question a few weeks ago from a client. You know, I'll get a compensation event for inflation, won't I? No. Oh, we didn't realise it. We've just signed up to this big contract. Oh dear. You've got a problem, haven't you? You're just stuck with it.
That was the contractor, not the client. Yeah.
No idea what they signed up to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, obviously, you know, some people go around and say, oh, well, the solution in NEC contracts is, you know, you go for X1. I always say X1 only protects you as a contractor to the extent that the indices that have been selected by the client actually is truly reflective of the work that you do. So, you know, if we go back a few years, RPI, CPI was about, you know, was okay. But certainly, you know, I think you've got to, at the time, looking at the contract, you know, as a contractor, push back and say, hey, well, look, you know, we had this with a contractor 2 or 3 years ago, and in terms of, well, they're saying, well, look, obviously, with the whole COVID thing, you know, we're looking at our inflation. And the client wanted to go, I think, RPI or CPI, whereas the contractor's inflation, I mean, even that time, I think it was running like 6%. But the contractor saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, we've got a shortage of material. No, our plant and material shortages are causing prices to rise by 20%. And of course, you know, I think you've got to look at the indices you say, because if you've signed it, you're stuck with it. So when you do your tender, you've got to look at that and say, well, what protection do I get? Is there a non-adjustable element? There's a bit of a debate the other day about that going on. I mean, I had a contract the other day that I was looking at. The non-adjustable element in terms of the indices was 90%. Honestly. So you know, you haven't really got, you know, you've got X1 in disguise, haven't you? So I think, yeah, you've just got, and I think this is a thing, and I think as a client as well, you've got to look at that, because you don't want, if a contractor is suffering and having difficulties, what is their recourse? And yeah, we don't really want to have inflated compensation, that's the quotations, but you know, what other, you've signed up, and I think I'm right in saying the law doesn't save you from signing up to a bad deal. So you've got to look at those risks, haven't you? Definitely. Yeah.
Excellent. One last question, dovetails in nicely actually with that last one. So if a contractor is continually assessing Cs incorrectly, is there any recourse for the PM to recover the cost of carrying out excessive project managers' assessments?
If a client asks me this, I get out the contract and check, but I'm pretty certain no.
Yeah, I think that's the right answer.
Makes you wonder what contract the PM's under, doesn't it? It must be a lump sum one, I'm guessing. Because if it was reimbursable, they wouldn't be bothered, would they? Now, what can you do about that? I mean, I often see people don't put enough effort into sort of compensation events at the outset of the contract to agree, what expectations are in terms of how they're presented, the level of detail that needs to be provided, and have those sort of arguments or discussions early on about, what the issues are. Because a lot of times, it seems like the most popular reason to reject a compensation event is lack of information. That can be easily addressed, surely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, why, there's a bit where you'd say, look, go get some training or something like that, isn't there?
Yeah,
If that's the
definitely.
issue, that they're not understanding how to actually do it.
In my experience, project managers don't do PMAs generally.
Really?
They just ask the contractor to provide another quote. In my
Yeah.
experience.
We're
Generally,
just
I would say
going round
that-
and round in circles for
go
months.
round in cir- yeah. So
I think that's a very valid point, actually. That is one of my bugbears in training. That you look at it, it's very clear, isn't it, that you should step in and make your own assessment. Yet most PMs don't do that.
Yeah.
okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
I thought we'd get through those questions a little bit quicker than we have done. I'm conscious that we've got drinks now available at 15:15, and we've overrun a little bit. I don't know if we want to take one last question from the audience, or if you're particularly thirsty and would like a cold beer. Very quickly, have we got any questions, or are we happy to wrap it up here? No, I think we're happy to wrap it here. Thanks again to all our speakers and to Futansi for sponsoring today's event. Please join us for a drink with the last question of today. Thank you.